friendship than the mere delight of a dramatist in one who helps him to achieve his end. This was indeed a subtle element of pleasure, if not of passion, and a noble basis for an artistic comradeship. But it was not all that the sonnets revealed to us. There was something beyond. There was the soul as well as the language of Neo-Platonism. "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom," said the stern Hebrew prophet. "The beginning of wisdom is love," was the gracious message of the Greek. And the spirit of the Renaissance, which already touched Hellenism at so many points, catched the inner meaning of this phrase, and divining its secret, sought to elevate friendship to the high dignity of the antique ideal, to make it a vital factor in the new culture, and a mode of self-conscious intellectual development. In 1492 appeared Marsilio Ficino's translation of the Symposium of Plato, and his wonderful dialogue of all the Platonic dialogues perhaps is the most perfect, as it is the most poetical, began to exercise a strange influence over men, and to color their words and thoughts and manner of living. In its subtle suggestions of sex in soul, in the curious analogies it draws between intellectual enthusiasm and the physical passion of love, in its dream of the incarnation of the idea in a beautiful and living form, and of a real spiritual conception with a travail and a bringing to birth, there was something that fascinated the poets and scholars of the 16th century. Shakespeare certainly was fascinated by it, and had read the dialogue, if not in Ficino's translation, of which many copies found their way to England, perhaps in that French translation by Leroy, to which Joachim du Bellay contributed so many graceful metrical versions. When he says to Willie Hughes, "He that calls on thee, let him bring forth eternal numbers to outlive long date," he is thinking of Diotima's theory that beauty is the goddess who presides over birth, and draws into light of day the dim conceptions of the soul, when he tells us of the marriage of true minds, and exhorts his friend to beget children that time cannot destroy. He is but repeating the words in which the prophetess tells us that friends are married by a far nearer tie than those who beget mortal children. For fairer and more immortal are the children who are their common offspring. So also Edward Blount, in his dedication of Hero and Leander, talks of Marlowe's work as his right children, being the issue of his brain. And when Bacon claims that the best works and of greatest merit for the public have proceeded from the unmarried and childless men, which both in affection and means have married and endowed the public, he is paraphrasing a passage in the Symposium. Friendship, indeed, could have desired no better warrant for its permanence or its ardors than the Platonic theory or creed, as we might better call it, that the true world was the world of ideas, and that these ideas took visible form and became incarnate in man. And it is only when we realize the influence of Neoplatonism on the Renaissance that we can understand the true meaning of the amatory phrases and words with which friends were wont at this time to address each other. There was a kind of mystic transference of the expressions of the physical world to a sphere that was spiritual, that was removed from gross bodily appetite, and in which the soul was lord. Love had entered the Olive Garden of the new Academy, but he wore the same flame-colored raiment and had the same words of passion on his lips. Michelangelo, the haughtiest spirit in Italy, as he has been called, addresses the young Tommaso Cavalieri in such fervent and passionate terms that some have thought that the sonnets in question must have been intended for that noble lady, the widow of the Marchese di Pescara, whose white hand, when she was dying, the great sculptor's lips had stooped to kiss. But that it was to Cavalieri that they were written, and that the literal interpretation is the right one, is evident not merely from the fact that Michelangelo plays with his name, as Shakespeare plays with the name of Willie Hughes, but from the direct evidence of Varchi, who was well acquainted with the young man, and who indeed tells us that he possessed, besides incomparable personal beauty, so much charm of nature, such excellent abilities, and such a graceful manner, that he deserved and still deserves to be the better loved the more he is known. Strange as these sonnets may seem to us now, when rightly interpreted, they merely serve to show with what intense and religious fervor Michelangelo addressed himself to the worship of intellectual beauty, and how, to borrow a fine phrase from Mr. Symonds, he pierced through the veil of flesh and sought the divine idea it imprisoned. In the sonnet written for Luigi del Riccio on the death of his friend, Caccino Bracci, we can also trace, as Mr. Symonds points out, the Platonic conception of love as nothing if not spiritual, and of beauty as a form that finds its immortality within the lover's soul. Caccino was a lad who died at the age of 17, and when Luigi asked Michelangelo to make a portrait of him, Michelangelo answered, "I can only do so by drawing you in whom he still lives." If the beloved in the lover shine, since art without him cannot work alone, thee I must carve to tell the world of him. The same idea is also put forward in Montaigne's noble essay on friendship, a passion which he ranks higher than the love of brother for brother or the love of man for woman. He tells us, I quote from Florio's translation, one of the books with which Shakespeare was familiar, how perfect amity is indivisible, how it possesseth the soul and sways it in all sovereignty, and how by the interposition of a spiritual beauty, the desire of a spiritual conception is engendered in the beloved. He writes of an internal beauty, of a difficile knowledge and abstruse discovery that is revealed unto friends, and unto friends only. He mourns for the dead Etienne de la Boetie in accents of wild grief and inconsolable love. The learned Hubert Languet, the friend of Melanchthon and of the leaders of the Reformed Church, tells the young Philip Sidney how he kept his portrait by him some hours to feast his eyes upon it, and how his appetite was rather increased than diminished by the sight. And Sidney writes to him, "The chief hope of my life, next to the everlasting blessedness of heaven, will always be the enjoyment of true friendship, and there you shall have the chiefest place." Later on, there came to Sidney's house in London one, some day to be burned at Rome for the sin of seeing God in all things, Giordano Bruno, just fresh from his triumph before the University of Paris. "A Sophia è necessario amore," were the words ever upon his lips, and there was something in his strange, ardent personality that made men feel that he had discovered the new secret of life. Ben Jordan, writing to one of his friends, subscribes himself "your true lover," and dedicates his noble eulogy on Shakespeare to the memory of my beloved. Richard Barnfield, in his "Affectionate Shepherd," flutes on soft Virgilian reed the story of his attachment to some young Elizabethan of the day. Out of all the eclogues, Abraham France selects the second for translation, and Fletcher's lines to Master W.C. show what fascination was hidden in the mere name of Alexis. It was no wonder, then, that Shakespeare had been stirred by a spirit that so stirred his age. There had been critics like Hallam, who had regretted that the sonnets had ever been written, who had seen in them something dangerous, something unlawful even. To them it would have been sufficient to answer in Chapman's noble words, "There is no danger to a man that knows what life and death is. There's not any law exceeds his knowledge, neither is it lawful that he should stoop to any other law." But it was evident that the sonnets needed no such defense as this, and that those who had talked of the folly of excessive and misplaced affection had not been able to interpret either the language or the spirit of these great poems, so intimately connected with the philosophy and the art of their time. It is no doubt true that to be filled with an absorbing passion is to surrender the security of one's lower life, and yet in such surrender there may be gain. Certainly there was for Shakespeare. When Pico della Mirandola crossed the threshold of the villa of Careggi and stood before Marsilio Ficino in all the grace and comeliness of his wonderful youth, the aged scholar seemed to see in him the realization of the Greek ideal, and determined to devote his remaining years to the translation of Plotinus, that new Plato, in whom, as Mr. Pater reminds us, the mystical element in the Platonic philosophy had been worked out to the utmost limit of vision and ecstasy. A romantic friendship with a young Roman of his day initiated Winckelmann into the secret of Greek art, taught him the mystery of its beauty and the meaning of its form. In Willie Hughes, Shakespeare found not merely a most delicate instrument for the presentation of his art, but the visible incarnation of his idea of beauty. And it is not too much to say to this young actor, whose very name the dull writers of his age forgot to chronicle, the romantic movement of English literature is largely indebted. 3. One evening, I thought that I had really discovered Willie Hughes in Elizabethan literature. In a wonderfully graphic account of the last days of the great Earl of Essex, his chaplain Thomas Snell tells us that the night before the Earl died he called William Hughes, which was his musician, to play upon the virginals and to sing. "Play," he said, "my song, Will Hughes, I will sing it myself." So he did most joyfully. So not so as the howling swan, which still looking down, waileth her end, but as a sweet lark lifting up his hands, and casting up his eyes to God, with this mounted the crystal skies, and reached with his unwearied tongue the top of the highest heavens. Surely, the boy who played on the virginals to the dying father of Sidney's Stella was none other than the Will Hughes to whom Shakespeare dedicated the sonnets, and who he tells us was himself sweet music to hear. Yet Lord Essex died in 1576, when Shakespeare was but 12 years of age. It was impossible that his musician could have been the Mr. W.H of the sonnets. Perhaps Shakespeare's young friend was the son of the player upon the virginals. It was at least something to have discovered that Will Hughes was an Elizabethan name. Indeed, the name Hughes seems to have been closely connected with music and the stage. The first English actress was the lovely Margaret Hughes, whom Prince Rupert so madly adored. What more probable than that between her and Lord Essex, musician, had come the boy actor of Shakespeare's plays? In 1587, a certain Thomas Hughes brought out at Gray's Inn a Euripidean tragedy entitled The Misfortunes of Arthur, receiving much assistance in the arrangement of the dumb shows from one Francis Bacon, then a student of law. Surely he was some near kinsman of the lad to whom Shakespeare said, "Take my loves, my love, yea, take them all." The profitless usurer of unused beauty, as he describes him. But the proofs, the links, where were they? Alas, I could not find them. It seemed to me that I was always on the brink of absolute verification, but that I could never really attain to it. I thought it strange that no one had ever written a history of the English boy actors of the 16th and 17th centuries, and determined to undertake the task myself and try to ascertain their true relations to the drama. The subject was certainly full of artistic interest. These lads had been the delicate reeds through which our poets had sounded their sweetest strains, the gracious vessels of honor into which they had poured the purple wine of their song. Foremost, naturally, among them had been the youth to whom Shakespeare had entrusted the realization of his most exquisite creations. Beauty had been his, such as our age has never or but rarely seen. A beauty that seemed to combine the charm of both sexes, and to have wedded, as the sonnets tell us, the grace of Adonis and the loveliness of Helen. He had been quick-witted too, and eloquent, and from those finely curved lips that the satirist had mocked had come the passionate cry of Juliet, and the bright laughter of Beatrice, Perdita's flower-like words, and Ophelia's wandering songs. Yet, as Shakespeare himself had been but as a god among giants, so Willie Hughes had only been one out of many marvelous lads to whom our English Renaissance owed something of the secret of its joy. And it appeared to me that they were also worthy of some study and record. In a little book with fine vellum leaves and damask silk cover, a fancy of mine in those fanciful days, I accordingly collected such information as I could about them, and even now there is something in the scanty record of their lives, in the mere mention of their names, that attracts me. I seem to know them all. Robin Armand, the goldsmith's lad who was lured by Tarleton to go on the stage. Sandford, whose performance of the courtesan Flamantia Lord Burleigh witnessed at Gray's Inn. Cook, who played Agrippina in the tragedy of Sejanus. Nat Field, whose young and beardless portrait is still preserved for us at Dulwich, and who, in Cynthia's Revels, played the queen and huntress chaste and fair. Gil Carey, who, attired as a mountain nymph, sang in the same lovely masque Echo's song of mourning for Narcissus. Parsons, the psalmist of the strange pageant of Tamburlaine. Will Ostler, who was one of the children of the Queen's Chapel and accompanied King James to Scotland. George Vernon, to whom the king sent a cloak of scarlet cloth and a cape of crimson velvet. Alec Gow, who performed the part of Sinis, Vespasian's concubine, in Massinger's Roman Actor, and 3 years later that of Acanthe, in the same dramatist's picture. Barrett, the heroine of Richard's tragedy of Messalina. Dickie Robinson, a very pretty fellow, Ben Jonson tells us, who was a member of Shakespeare's company, and was known for his exquisite taste in costume, as well as for his love of women's apparel. Salathiel Pavey, whose early and tragic death Jonson mourned in one of the sweetest threnodies of our literature. Arthur Saville, who was one of the players of Prince Charles, and took a girl's part in a comedy by Marmion. Stephen Hamerton, a most noted and beautiful woman actor, whose pale oval face with its heavy-lidded eyes and somewhat sensuous mouth looks out at us from a curious miniature of the time. Hart, who made his first success by playing the Duchess in the tragedy of the Cardinal, and who, in a poem that is clearly modeled upon some of Shakespeare's sonnets, is described by one who had seen him as beauty to the eye and music to the ear, and Kynaston, of whom Betterton said that it has been disputed among the judicious whether any woman could have more sensibly touched the passions, and whose white hands and amber-colored hair seemed to have been retarded by some years the introduction of actresses upon our stage. The Puritans, with their uncouth morals and ignoble minds, had of course railed against them, and dwelt on the impropriety of boys disguising as women, and learning to affect the manners and passions of the female sex. Gosson, with his shrill voice, and Prynne, soon to be made earless for many shameful slanders, and others to whom the rare and subtle sense of abstract beauty was denied, had from the pulpit and through pamphlet said foul or foolish things to their dishonor. To Francis Lenton, writing in 1629 what he speaks of as loose action, mimic gesture, by a poor boy clad in a princely vesture, is but one of many tempting baits of hell, which draw more youth unto the damned cell of furious lust than all the devil could do since he obtained his first overthrow. Deuteronomy was quoted, and the ill-digested learning of the period laid under contribution, even in our own time, had not appreciated the artistic conditions of the Elizabethan and Jacobean drama. One of the most brilliant and intellectual actresses of this century had laughed at the idea of a lad of 17 or 18 playing Imogen, or Miranda, or Rosalind. How could any youth, however gifted and specially trained, even faintly suggest these fair and noble women to an audience? One quite pities Shakespeare, who had to put up with seeing his brightest creations marred, misrepresented, and spoiled. In his book on Shakespearean predecessors, Mr. John Addington Symonds, who had also talked of hobbledehoys trying to represent the pathos of Desdemona and Juliet's passion. Were they right? Are they right? I did not think so then, I do not think so now. Those who remember the Oxford production of the Agamemnon, the fine utterance and marble dignity of the Clytemnestra, the romantic and imaginative rendering of the prophetic madness of Cassandra, will not agree with Lady Martin or Mr. Symonds in their strictures on the conditions of the Elizabethan stage. Of all the motives of dramatic curiosity used by our great playwrights, there is none more subtle or more fascinating than the ambiguity of the sexes. This idea, invented as far as an artistic idea can be said to be invented by Lilly, perfected and made exquisite for us by Shakespeare, seems to me to owe its origin, as it certainly owes its possibility of lifelike presentation, to the circumstance that the Elizabethan stage, like the stage of the Greeks, admitted the appearance of no female performers. It is because Lilly was writing for the boy actors of St. Paul that we have confused sexes and complicated loves for Philydia and Galathea. It is because Shakespeare was writing for Willie Hughes that Rosalind dons doublet and hose and calls herself Ganymede. that Viola and Julia put on pages' dresses, that Imogen steals away in male attire. To say that only women can portray the passions of a woman and that therefore no boy can play Rosalind is to rob the art of acting of all claim to objectivity, and to assign to the mere act of sex what properly belongs to imaginative insight and creative energy. Indeed, if sex be an element in artistic creation, it might rather be urged that the delightful combination of wit and romance which characterizes so many of Shakespeare's heroines was at least occasioned, if it was not actually caused, by the fact that the players of these parts were lads and young men, whose passionate purity, quick mobile fancy, and healthy freedom from sentimentality can hardly fail to have suggested a new and delightful type of girlhood or of womanhood. The very difference of sex between the player and the part he represented must also, as Professor Ward points out, have constituted one more demand upon the imaginative capacities of the spectators, and must have kept them from that over-realistic identification of the actor with his role, which is one of the weak points in modern theatrical criticism. This, too, must be granted, that it was to the boy actors that we owe the introduction of these lovely lyrics that star the plays of Shakespeare, Dekker, and so many of the dramatists of the period, that those snatches of bird-like or godlike song, as Mr. Swinburne calls them. For it was out of the choirs of the cathedrals and royal chapels of England that most of these lads came, and from their earliest years they had been trained in the singing of anthems and madrigals, and in all that concerns the subtle art of music. Chosen at first for the beauty of their voices, as well as for a certain comeliness and freshness of appearance, they were then instructed in gesture, dancing, and elocution, and taught to play both tragedies and comedies in the English as well as in the Latin language. Indeed, acting seems to have formed part of the ordinary education of the time, and to have been much studied not merely by the scholars of Eton and Westminster, but also by the students at the universities of Oxford and Cambridge, some of whom went afterwards upon the public stage, as is becoming not uncommon in our own day. The great actors, too, had their pupils and apprentices, who were formerly bound over to them by legal warrant, to whom they imparted the secrets of their craft, and who were so much valued that we read of Henslowe, one of the managers of the Rose Theatre, buying a trained boy of the name of James Bristow for 8 pieces of gold. The relations that existed between the masters and their pupils seems to have been one of the most cordial and affectionate character. Robin Armyn was looked upon by Tarleton as his adopted son, and in a will dated the 5th day of May, Anno Domini 1605, Augustine Phillips, Shakespeare's dear friend and fellow actor, bequeathed to one of his apprentices his purple cloak, sword, and dagger, his bass viol, and much rich apparel, and to another a sum of money and many beautiful instruments of music, to be delivered unto him at the expiration of his term of years in his indenture of apprenticeship. Now and then, when some daring actor kidnapped a boy for the stage, there was an outcry or an investigation. In 1600, for instance, a certain Norfolk gentleman of the name of Henry Clifton came to live in London in order that his son, then about 13 years of age, might have the opportunity of attending the Bluecoat School, and from a petition which he presented to the Star Chamber, and which has been recently brought to light by Mr. Greenstreet, we learn that as the boy was walking quietly to Christ Church Cloister one winter morning, he was waylaid by James Robinson, Henry Evans, and Nathaniel Giles, and carried off to the Blackfriars Theatre, amongst a company of lewd and dissolute mercenary players, as his father calls him, in order that he might be trained in acting of parts in base plays and interludes. Hearing of his son's misadventure, Mr. Clifton went down at once to the theatre, and demanded his surrender. But the said Nathaniel Giles, James Robinson, and Henry Evans, most arrogantly then and there, answered that they had authority sufficient so to take any nobleman's son in this land, and handing the young schoolboy a scroll of paper containing part of one of their said plays and interludes, commanded him to learn it by heart. Through a warrant issued by Sir John Fortescue, however, the boy was restored to his father the next day, and the Court of Star Chamber seems to have suspended or cancelled Evan's privileges. The fact is that following a precedent set by Richard III, Elizabeth had issued a commission authorizing certain persons to impress into her service all boys who had beautiful voices, that they might sing for her in her chapel royal, and Nathaniel Giles, her chief commissioner, finding that he could deal profitably with the managers of the Globe Theatre, agreed to supply them with personable and graceful lads for the playing of female parts, under color of taking them for the Queen's service. The actors accordingly had a certain amount of legal warrant on their side, and it is interesting to note that many of the boys whom they carried off from their schools or homes, such as Salathiel Pavy, Natfield, and Alvery Tressel, became so fascinated by their new art that they attached themselves permanently to the theatre and would not leave it. Once it seemed as if girls were to take the place of boys on the stage, and among the christenings chronicled in their registers of St. Giles Cripplegate occurs the following strange and suggestive entry of Comedia, base-born, daughter of Alice Boker and William Johnson, one of the Queen's players, 10 February, 1589. But the child upon whom such high hopes had been built died at 6 years of age, and when later on some French actresses came over and played at Blackfriars, we learned that they were hissed, hooted, and pippin-pelted from the stage. I think that, from what I have said above, we need not regret in any way the essentially male culture of the English Renaissance found its fullest and most perfect expression by its own method and in its own manner. I remember I used to wonder at this time what had been the social position and early life of Willie Hughes before Shakespeare had met him. My investigations into the history of the boy actor had made me curious of every detail about him. Had he stood in the carved stall of some gilded choir, reading out of a great book, painted with square scarlet notes and long black key lines? We know from the sonnets how clear and pure his voice was, and what skill he had in the art of music. Noble gentlemen, such as the Earl of Leicester and Lord Oxford, had companies of boy players in their service as part of their household. When Leicester went to the Netherlands in 1585, he brought with him a certain Will, described as a player. Was this Willie Hughes? Had he acted for Leicester at Kenilworth, and was it there that Shakespeare had first known him? Or was he, like Robin Armin, simply a lad of low degree, but possessing some strange beauty and marvelous fascination. It was evident from the early sonnets that when Shakespeare first came across him, he had no connection whatsoever with the stage, and that he was not of high birth has already been shown. I began to think of him not as the delicate chorister of a royal chapel, not as a petted minion trained to sing and dance in Leicester's stately masque, but as some fair-haired English lad, whom in one of London's hurrying streets, or on Windsor's green silent meadows, Shakespeare had seen and followed. Recognizing the artistic possibilities that lay hidden in so comely and gracious a form, and divining by a quick and subtle instinct what an actor the lad would make could he be induced to go on the stage. At this time, Willie Hughes's father was dead, as we learn from Sonnet 13, and his mother, whose remarkable beauty he is said to have inherited, may have been induced to allow him to become Shakespeare's apprentice by the fact that boys who played female characters were paid extremely large salaries. Larger salaries indeed than were given to grown-up actors. Shakespeare's apprentice, at any rate, we know that he became, and we know what a vital factor he was in the development of Shakespeare's art. As a rule, a boy actor's capacity for representing girlish parts on the stage lasted but for a few years at most. Such characters as Lady Macbeth, Queen Constance, and Volumnia remained, of course, always within the reach of those who had true dramatic genius and noble presence. Absolute youth was not necessary here, not desirable even, but with Imogen and Perdita and Juliet it was different. "Your beard has begun to grow, and I pray God your voice be not cracked," says Hamlet mockingly to the boy actor of the strolling company that came to visit him at Elsinore. And certainly, when chains grew rough and voices harsh, much of the charm and grace of the performance must have gone. Hence comes Shakespeare's passionate preoccupation with the youth of Willie Hughes, his terror of old age and wasting years, his wild appeal to time to spare the beauty of his friend. "Make glad and sorry seasons as thou fleet'st, and do whate'er thou wilt, swift-footed time, to the wide world and all her fading sweets, but I forbid thee one most heinous crime. O carve not with the hours my love's fair brow, nor draw no lines there with thine antique pen. Him in thy course untainted do allow for beauty's pattern to succeeding men." Time seems to have listened to Shakespeare's prayers, or perhaps Willie Hughes had the secret of perpetual youth. After 3 years, he is quite unchanged. "To me, fair friend, you can never be old, for as you were when first your eye I eyed. You, my friend, to me, fair friend, you can never be old, for as you were when first your eye I eyed, such seems your beauty still. 3 winters cold have from the forest shook 3 summers' pride. 3 beauteous springs to yellow autumn turned. In the process of the seasons have I seen 3 April perfumes, and 3 hot Junes burned, since first I saw you fresh, which yet are green. More years pass over, and the bloom of his boyhood seems to be still with him, when in The Tempest, Shakespeare, through the lips of Prospero, flung away the wand of his imagination and gave his poetic sovereignty into the weak, graceful hands of Fletcher. It may be that the Miranda who stood wondering by was none other than Willie Hughes himself, and in the last sonnet that his friend addressed to him, the enemy that is feared is not time, but death. O thou, my lovely boy, who in thy power dost hold time's fickle glass, his sickle hour, who hast by waning grown, and therein show'st thy lover's withering is thy sweet self grossed. If nature's sovereign mistress overrack, as thou goest onward, still will pluck thee back. She keeps thee to this purpose, that her skill may time disgrace, and weary wretched minutes kill. Yet fear her, O thou minion of her pleasure. She may detain, but not still keep, her treasure. Her audit, though delayed, answered must be, and her quietus is to render thee. It was not for some weeks, after I had begun my study of the subject, that I ventured to approach the curious group of sonnets that deal with the dark woman, who, like a shadow or a thing of evil omen, came across Shakespeare's romance, and for a season stood between him and Willie Hughes. They were obviously printed out of their proper place, and should have been inserted between sonnets 33 and XL. Psychological and artistic reasons necessitated this change, a change which I hope will be adopted by all future editors, as without it an entirely false impression is conveyed of the nature and final issue of this noble friendship. Who was she, this black-browned, olive-skinned woman, with her amorous mouth that love's own hand did make, her cruel eye and her foul pride, her strange skill on the virginals, and her false fascinating nature? An over-curious scholar of our day had seen her in a symbol of the Catholic Church, of that bride of Christ who is black but comely. Professor Mento, following in the footsteps of Henry Brown, had regarded the whole group of sonnets as simply exercises of skill undertaken in a spirit of wanton defiance and derision of the commonplace. Mr. Gerald Massey, without any historical proof or probability, had insisted that they were addressed to the celebrated Lady Rich, the Stella of Sir Philip Sidney's sonnets, the Philoclea of his Arcadia, and that they contained no personal revelation of Shakespeare's life and love, having been written in Lord Pembroke's name and at his request. Mr. Tyler had suggested that they referred to one of Queen Elizabeth's maids of honor, by name Mary Fitton, but none of these explanations satisfied the conditions of the problem. The woman that came between Shakespeare and Willie Hughes was a real woman, black-haired and married, of evil repute. Lady Rich's fame was evil enough, it is true, but her hair was of fine threads of finest gold, in curled knots man's thought to hold, and her shoulders like white doves perching. She was, as King James said to her lover, Lord Mountjoy, a fair woman with a black soul. As for Mary Fitton, we know that she was unmarried in 1601, the time when her amour with Lord Pembroke was discovered. And besides, any theories that connected Lord Pembroke to the sonnets were, as Cyril Graham had shown, put entirely out of court by the fact that Lord Pembroke did not come to London till they had been actually written and read by Shakespeare to his friends. It was not, however, her name that interested me. I was content to hold with Professor Dowden that to the eyes of no diver among the wrecks of time will that curious talisman gleam. What I wanted to discover was the nature of her influence over Shakespeare, as well as the characteristics of her personality. Two things were certain. She was much older than the poet, and the fascination that she exercised over him was at first purely intellectual. He began by feeling no physical passion toward her. "I do not love thee with mine eyes," he said, "nor are mine ears with thy tongue's tune delighted, nor tender feeling to base touches prone, nor taste nor smell desire to be invited to any sensual feast with thee alone." He did not even think her beautiful. "My mistress' eyes are nothing to the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips are red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head." He had his moments of loathing of her, for not content with enslaving the soul of Shakespeare, she seems to have sought to snare the senses of Willie Hughes. Then Shakespeare cries aloud, "Two loves I have of comfort and despair, which like two spirits do suggest me still. The better angel is a man right fair, the worser spirit of a woman colored ill. To win me soon to hell, my female evil tempteth my better angel from my side, and would corrupt my saint to be a devil, wooing his purity with her foul pride. Then he sees her as she really is, the bay where all men ride, the wide world's commonplace, the woman who is in the very refuse of her evil deeds, and who is as black as hell, dark as night. Then it is that he pens the great sonnet upon lust, the expense of spirit and a waste of shame, of which Mr. Theodore Watts says rightly that it is the greatest sonnet ever written, and it is then also that he offers to mortgage his very life and genius to her, if she will but restore to him that sweetest friend of whom she had robbed him. To compass this end, he abandons himself to her, feigns to be full of an absorbing and sensuous passion of possession, forges false words of love, lies to her, and tells her that he lies. "My thoughts and my discourse are as madmen's are, and random from the truth vainly expressed. For I have sworn thee fair, and thought thee bright, who art as black as hell, as dark as night." Rather than suffer his friend to be treacherous to him, he will himself be treacherous to his friend. To shield his purity, he will himself be vile. He knew the weakness of the boy actor's nature, his susceptibility to praise, his inordinate love of admiration, and deliberately set himself to fascinate the woman who had come between them. It is never with impunity that one's lips say love's litany. Words have their mystical power over the soul, and form can create the feeling from which it should have sprung. Sincerity itself, the ardent, momentary sincerity of the artist, is often the unconscious result of style, and in the case of those rare temperaments that are exquisitely susceptible to the influences of language, the use of certain phrases and modes of expression can stir the very pulse of passion, can send the red blood coursing through the veins, and can transform into a strange sensuous energy what in its origin had been mere aesthetic impulse and desire of art. So at least it seems to have been with Shakespeare. He begins by pretending to love, wears a lover's apparel, and has a lover's words upon his lips. What does it matter? It is only acting, only a comedy in real life. Suddenly, he finds that what his tongue had spoken his soul had listened to, and that the raiment that he had put on for disguise is a plague-stricken and poisonous thing that eats into his flesh, and that he cannot throw away. Then comes desire, with its many melodies, and lust that makes one love all one loathes, and shame, with its ashen face and secret smile. He is enthralled by this dark woman, is for a season separated from his friend, and becomes the vassal wretch of one whom he knows to be evil and perverse and unworthy of his love, as of the love of Willie. "Oh, from what power," he says, "hast thou this powerful might, with insufficiency my heart to sway, to make me give the lie to my true sight, and swear that the brightness does not grace the day? Whence hast thou this becoming of things ill, that in the very refuse of thy deeds there is such strength and warranties of skill, that in my mind thy worst all best exceeds?" He is keenly conscious of his own degradation, and finally realizing that his genius is nothing to her compared to the physical beauty of the young actor, he cuts with a quick knife the bond that binds him to her, and in this bitter sonnet bids her farewell. "In loving thee thou know'st I am forsworn, but thou art twice forsworn to me love swearing. In act thy bed vow broke, and new faith torn, and vowing new hate after new love bearing. But why of 2 oaths breached do I accuse thee, when I break 20? I am perjured most. For all my vows are oaths but to misuse thee, and all my honest faith in thee is lost. For I have sworn deep oaths of kindness, and to enlighten thee gave eyes to blindness. Oh, made them swear against the thing they see, for I have sworn thee fair, more perjured I, to swear against truth so foul a lie." His attitude toward Willie Hughes in the whole matter shows at once the fervor and the self-abnegation of the great love he bore him. There is a poignant touch of pathos in the close of his sonnet. "Those pretty wrongs that liberty commits, when I am some time absent from thy heart, thy beauty and thy years full well befits, for still temptation follows where thou art. Gentle thou art, and therefore to be won, beauteous thou art, therefore to be assailed. And when a woman woos, what woman's son will sourly leave her till she have prevailed? Ay me, but yeah thou mightst my seat forbear, and chide thy beauty and thy straying youth, who lead thee in their riot, even there where thou art forced to break a twofold truth, hers by thy beauty tempting her to thee, thine by thy beauty being false to me." But here he makes it manifest that his forgiveness was full and complete. "No more be grieved at that which thou hast done. Roses have thorns, and silver fountains mud. Clouds and eclipses stain both moon and sun, and loathsome canker lives in sweetest bud. All men make faults, and even in this, authorizing thy trespass with compare, myself corrupting, solving thy amiss, excusing thy sins more than thy sins are. For to thy sensual fault I bring in sense, the adverse party is thy advocate, and 'gainst myself a lawful plea commence, such civil war is in my love and hate, that I an accessory needs must be to that sweet thief which sourly robs from me."